If I ever go on Amazing Race, remind me to bring Lacey Hopper.
My name's Lacey. I live in Frederick, and I ruck for fun.
Yes, we have the same name.
So I'm just going to load up my ruck real quick.
Lacey has short hair, shaved on the sides, and heart-shaped sunglasses.
All the pockets.
This is a whole cool thing.
And she looks powerful.
Bladder.
She's wearing a t-shirt that says beer in all caps.
Hydration is always important.
When Lacey says she rucks, she's talking about a military exercise. It's basically a foot march with a loaded pack. But it's also becoming popular among civilians, like her, which is part of the reason I was interested, and which explains why she's loading these big round discs into her pack.
So there's that plate. No, it's good. All right, so I got a ruck for you. This is called a bullet.
One day after work, Lacey agreed to take me rucking along the creek and through Baker Park in Frederick, Maryland, so I could experience rucking for myself. By the way, I was about 8 months pregnant when we did this, so you could argue I was already rucking.
Yeah, let's start with the 1.5 and see how it goes.
You literally put it on and you hike it up.
Okay.
You want the weight as high as you possibly
Just get it
can.
up really high.
We set off.
Currently, because I'm training, I've got 30 in mind.
Yeah. So what are you training for?
Some really crazy events coming up.
Thanks to the Go Ruck franchise, which was started by a former Green Beret, you can ruck for fun now. And there are organized events. Although it's not like everyone's idea of fun.
They'll throw PT at you, anything from a sandbag to...
Really? So they're adding on to your weight as you're going?
Tree, curb stops. They're very creative on breaking you down.
In one type of event, it's called a tough, you carry your pack for about 12 hours overnight.
You can't have a phone. You can't have watches. You're not supposed to know what time it is.
But there's more.
They'll say, all right, we're going to do push-ups, 8-count flutter kicks, ruck swings, hold your ruck above your head. You'll find the bottom of a squat. We did hydro burpees, 3 hours in a duck pound. It was gross.
Oh, and you have to carry your own food.
Nobody's handing you a banana.
Lacey's nutrition of choice?
I cook a pound of bacon and I throw it in a Ziploc, and mostly it's bacon. And then
that event she's training for, it's actually 3 events, back to back, with just an hour or 2 in between.
Do my math for me then.
I just ended up starting to say it was probably going to end up being about 45 hours. It's a 9/11 memorial event.
So Lacey will, more or less, be rucking for 2 days straight. Why, you may ask? And how did a military training exercise like this take off in the civilian world in the first place? On this episode of Things That Go Boom, we're looking at the ways that civilian and military cultures are merging and diverging after 2 decades of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we ask what this all means for President Joe Biden as he refocuses foreign policy in a way that's meant to give a leg up to the middle class. Are we ready, culturally, fiscally, to reimagine national security? Hey, it's Lacey. As you likely already know, we are living in the golden age of cybercrime. How can we ensure the security of our information and our financials, not to mention our peace of mind? Well, I recommend listening to What the Hack with Adam Levin. It's a weekly true crime podcast featuring tales of hacks, scams, and a rattle bag of cyber swindles. Learn about the dangers of trolling opponents, discover what sort of links you should never, ever click, and get the inside scoop on all sorts of crazy scams happening on your favorite apps. So go ahead, follow What the Hack with Adam Levin on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Maybe you've noticed a certain military aesthetic seeping into your own surroundings. You know, like camouflage yoga pants, tactical clothing lines, the kind of stuff you might wear if you were delivering a metal suitcase with a combination lock to someone at a small airport. Did you know, actually, that our trucks and SUVs aren't just tanks in the proverbial sense? They're actually almost as big as the Sherman tanks that won World War II. Or maybe you've heard of something called MILSIM.
Pushing right. Left, watch your left.
Like real-life events where participants suit up in military apparel and air guns and simulate frontline combat.
Hey, they're moving on you.
A lot of tactical out there is another term that gets used a lot. And I get wanting to be tactical. This younger generation coming out of 9/11, watching a lot of our schoolmates and et cetera, like go and become these soldiers, and that is inspiring. And because we've been in these wars for these past 20 years, a lot of it is there, right?
Lacey isn't into the tactical thing so much herself. She rucks for the camaraderie and the fitness. She told us about a gym she goes to called Soldier Fit. You can take classes styled after boot camp. In some workouts, you lift sandbags.
I used to be a Planet Fitness girl, and I think I had that membership for 3 years, and I think I went 5 times. Soldier Fit, I now have this group of women that work out together every day. I'm always building families is what I'm doing.
As far as the rucking goes, there are brew rucks, like endurance bar hopping, and rucks to clean up parks. But the more serious events, they're often led by former military guys.
Most events are themed towards honoring something. They do Veterans Day events, obviously the Memorial Day, 4th of July. The one here in Frederick was Fallujah is what they were breaking down and honoring. And what they'll do is they'll break down what happened. So for Fallujah, we learned how they would move within those blocks.
Lacey's actually kind of an outlier. Most civilians don't take the time to learn what troops experience when they get deployed. In fact, a lot of civilians don't have close friends who are veterans. Unlike previous generations under the draft, less than 1% of our population serves in the military. That means a tiny, tiny slice of Americans served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the rest basically watched on TV. Maybe. Lacey says there's something about the military aspect of these events that lends itself to forming super tight bonds with the team. She says she's made friends for life.
Yeah, psychologically, I think the military is definitely built in that capacity. That mental piece, I mean, that's huge. In the middle of the night, when it doesn't feel like you're making any progress, and you don't know when the end is, there's like a quiet hour that's pretty terrible. Most of it just really hurts. And once you finally get through some of those things, like the wheels falling off and coming back together, it turns into such a camaraderie.
It's no accident the event she's training for commemorates 9/11. She remembers it like it was yesterday. She was in high school.
We didn't have a TV in our room, but we heard over the PA, teachers, turn on your TVs, teach this. Everybody was just, what's going on? What is this? And I don't know. They dismissed us, I think, at lunch. And I remember going home, and my dad was in the living room.
Lacey's dad had been paralyzed in a road accident as a young man.
So he was sitting there in his wheelchair, and I walked up and I put my hand on his, and I said, what are we going to do? Like, what is this? It was one of those, it was the JFK moment for my generation. I feel like I knew exactly where I was. And then also those that chose to go fight for it. We've lost a lot, and I think it's important to honor them, all of them.
Lacey and I don't just have the same name. We're also almost exactly the same age. So I had a similar experience. Sitting in school, shocked, not 100% sure of what I was looking at until just a few years later, I found myself at George Washington University studying counterinsurgency. I'm not sure I'd have gone into national security if it weren't for 9/11. But that's nothing unique. 9/11 changed us all. 9/11 also sent our country down a new foreign policy path, kicking off the so-called war on terror and leading us down a path toward 20 years of war, trillions of dollars in spending, and hundreds of thousands of lives lost. In the meantime, at home, the middle class was squeezed by income inequality, student debt, and stagnant wages. So we find ourselves here, at another pivot point. Biden's foreign policy for the middle class is meant to put more emphasis on spending at home, which one would assume would require some trade-offs in all that stuff we've been spending our money on, stuff like weapons. Lacey says she's okay with buying fewer weapons, but she'd like to see some of that money spent doing more for the men and women who've served. Some of the Rucking events she does actually raise funds for vets. Of course, Rucking is nothing new or mysterious to those people who have served. Timur Nersesov is a software manager, but he's also an Army Reserve officer. So he's done his share of rucking.
I think that's a very healthy thing to do. It's like, great, so long as you do it safely. Very easy to get hurt. Have a few Army injuries from that.
Timur wanted us to emphasize that he's not speaking for the military. His views are his own. But he's also noticed military style, stuff that goes beyond just fitness, becoming pretty popular. Can you describe, this is like separate but possibly related, can you describe vet bro culture for me?
Oh, vet bro. Yeah. So it might be familiar. So it's basically this overt stylization of military stuff in the civilian world, like T-shirts that just proudly emblazon rifles and military paraphernalia, haircuts, the way you dress, the way you talk, and sort of emulate sort of soldier speak, if you will.
It's hard for Timur to take that kind of stylization of military weapons and culture seriously. In 2009, he led a reconnaissance platoon in Iraq. One of their jobs was to protect explosive ordnance specialists. You know, the guys who detect and dispose of bombs. And he's been on almost 300 combat patrols. It's scary stuff. And taking it on is a lot of responsibility. But he says that's a responsibility that he loved from the start.
It was everything kind of what I signed up to do, right? That you want to do Army stuff when you join the Army. And that was about as Army as you get. You're in your 20s and you are given an immense amount of responsibility, immense amount of firepower, relatively little guidance compared to what a 24, 25-year-old analyst in a company gets. And your job is to be successful. That's the criteria. The criteria is win. And that's motivating, for some of us.
What's weirdest for folks like Timur is that even as military culture seems like it's popping up everywhere in our civilian life, with things like rucking, soldier fit gyms, and vet bros, the civil-military divide is actually growing. So much so that the Department of Defense has been raising red flags about it. Partly because, well, a lot of folks are really into playing soldier. Fewer and fewer are interested in signing up to do the real thing. These days, those who do sign up mostly come from the same places. 42% of the men and women who join the military come from just 6 states. And new recruits tend to come from military families, which is Timur's case.
Yeah, so grandparents, great-grandparents, uncles, World War I on. I always knew I was going to be in the Army. That was just a given.
Timur felt the divide between military and civilian life really hard when he came home and started looking for a job as a civilian, especially after being responsible for other people's lives.
I just got really frustrated with just, one of it was getting typecast. Coming out as a tanker, even as an officer, it's very hard to explain to people what you did for a living. So it's like, hey, can you give me a job? I can take a bunch of guys with guns and do a thing. That is a great qualifications for go run a warehouse, which is my first job out of the Army. And I was like, this is awful.
Right.
And so I wasn't doing what I was wanting to do.
So after watching a reality show about a Navy explosive ordnance disposal unit in Afghanistan one day, he made a split decision to go back in.
And in my mind, it just flipped. My very first mission in Iraq was an EOD escort mission. And I was like, I was that guy.
You were like, were you happier as that guy?
I mean, yeah, well, that was part of the whole, best job I ever had business. It brought a lot of sensation back. And it's like, I don't want to be that distant from that experience.
Timur says even beyond the civil-military divide, right now the profile of a veteran is also shifting under everyone's feet. The men and women who have served in Afghanistan and Iraq might not have that much in common with older vets who were drafted to fight in Vietnam, for example.
The Vietnam vet, with a few exceptions of really people that were professional and stayed for a while, that went 2 or 3 times, 90% of them spent a year. And it was a year of hell for them, and there was no front and back end to it. They weren't serving 5-6 year terms like our guys are now. Some of these guys have gone 3-4 times over. 5. I know people have deployed 5 times. Now, I only did it once. But like when your entire career is war and you live and breathe it, it's just a very different perspective than there was a war at one point in your career.
Now that he's back in civilian life again, he has a few opinions about the way that military culture is sometimes appropriated in the civilian world. Among his pet peeves, calling athletes warriors.
However, a new study found that so-called weekend warriors may still get most of the same health benefits as those who exercise regularly.
Or declaring war on everything.
We must declare war on this virus.
War on COVID, war on drugs.
The new war on drugs in the Philippines.
War on Christmas.
War on Christmas? War on Christmas.
War on Christmas!
And then there are the civilians who've taken that vet bro culture that we mentioned earlier to a darker place.
And more recently, I guess within the last 2 years in particular, it started being heavily associated with sort of a hard, far-right, the three percenters, for example.
That's a popular concept with far-right militias, one that's based on the false claim that only 3% of Americans fought in the Revolutionary War against the British, something like a well-regulated militia with all of the requisite gear.
So like the January 6th crowd, for example, the ones that were wearing helmets and vests and all that stuff. I mean, to me, that's at best like vulgar. They are posers, basically. I mean, it's the only way to put it. I mean, and especially when you see some of those guys, I mean, and they're like, they couldn't run a quarter of a mile without toppling over. And you're like, come on, man. Like, it's purely a display.
Far-right militias, of course, have a lot of complicated reasons for dressing up in that tactical gear. Some say they're citizen soldiers, upholding the Constitution. But another reason could be that confidence in the military remains really, really high, even as fewer and fewer young Americans seem to be interested in signing up. In 2020, 69% of Americans expressed a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in the military, down slightly from 74% in 2019.
And I think that's what they're fishing for, to be honest. They're fishing for that legitimacy and support.
I mean, like, my super amateur anthropologist take on this is that for 20 years, we as an American people have held the military at a distance. Like, you are the heroes. And we held them as better and stronger and purer and more patriotic than all of us.
On the other side of the break, we'll talk about how this dynamic plays out when you trot on over to Capitol Hill and try to rejigger the way that we allocate funds for defense. It's a journey that some White House officials might have to consider under Biden's foreign policy for the middle class. Once you get inside the Beltway, the civil-military divide takes a, well, maybe not such a surprising turn. It seeps right into the language policymakers use to refer to the Department of Defense.
We talk about building partner capacity or train, advise, and assist by, with, and through partners. So all of these words that I just used are distancing words.
That's Loren DeJonge Schulman, sister national security nerd.
I am an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security.
A lot of the words that folks in Washington use to refer to national security, they serve to distance us all from the messy work that is national security. And in some cases, to pass the buck to our partners.
They're words that mean that we are not the primary actor. Somebody else is doing the hard stuff. They're doing the risky stuff. We're doing things off to the side.
So much off to the side that when troops are killed, ours or our coalition partners, it doesn't necessarily get a lot of play outside that small so-called warrior class of people doing the fighting. Not in the news, not in the White House press room, and not on the floor of Congress.
And that tells me that we have accepted that. We as an American people have accepted that as a cost that is just like the cost of doing business.
Does the civil-military divide in this case, the fact that Americans don't actually have a connection to war, does that have an impact on policymaking?
Gosh, yes. And I could nerd out for hours on this topic.
Loren says one obstacle is that a lot of Americans have a very limited understanding of what the military actually does.
So I think that purposeful distancing that we do in our language has had a lot of impact on how Americans think about what the military is doing and capable of doing. They're doing all kinds of stuff, but it's not really war.
If Americans don't really hear about the messy stuff that often, people dying, cities destroyed, let alone meet the people who are living the reality of our foreign wars daily overseas, it's easy to slip into complacency. Feel like the quote-unquote forever war, isn't really much of a war at all.
It's kind of like sort of war, and it seems to be doing something that we're doing forever. So maybe it's okay, and I don't need to worry about it. But another important component of that is having a conversation with American people around what makes them feel secure or insecure and what sort of value they want to get out of their military and out of their national security investment. Because they're probably going to start with, I'm not really sure, or you guys are doing good, I guess, and that I feel comfortable with that. I don't want terrorism.
Having a frank and informed conversation with the American people about our military spending and our military actions might result in a lot of changes to the way we do business. It might even result in cuts to the defense budget or shifts to the spending within.
Turn to the defense piece of the proposal.
But so far, the Biden administration hasn't really shifted its overall spending much from Trump.
We know the White House would like to allocate $715 billion to the Pentagon in fiscal 2022, which would be a 1.4% increase or adjustment.
Loren says that those top-line levels of spending, they're not exactly out of place with what you'd expect from a budget for the middle class.
But it should look very different underneath the hood. And I don't think we're quite there yet.
So big legacy weapons like tanks, planes, and aircraft carriers, maybe we don't need so much of that. Maybe the defense budget can actually work better for the middle class.
Another way to think about it is are there investments that come out of the defense budget that are about American innovation and technology and jobs growth and human capital in a more purposeful way than they are now?
Of course, lawmakers aren't exactly looking for opportunities to have these tough conversations. Loren says a lot of lawmakers see national security as a political minefield they just don't want to wander into. And a lot of that has to do with the way that we talk about defense. Instead of talking about ways that the defense budget might work better for the American people, lawmakers usually focus on what it's doing for them now.
And an easy metric for members of Congress is 10 F-35s are built in our district, or here's the number of jobs that we've created here. So how do you kind of hack into that system of metrics that we use right now of how many ships we have in the U.S. Navy or how many jobs we've created at different defense industry corporations, things like that, in order to persuade people that slightly different forms of investment both keep them safe but are also politically salient, politically relevant to that conversation?
She says that the metrics that we use now just don't actually tell us how safe we are or the value that American people are getting out of their investment.
I think we've identified that, this feels uncomfortable, and probably most Americans don't care how many F-35s we buy or how many ships there are in the Navy. But that's just the metric that we feel comfortable with, so let's go with it. I think that if you dug really deep into it, they would not feel comfortable with many of the investments. They would not feel comfortable with many of the deployments. They would not feel comfortable with many of the authorizations.
She says that shifting the metrics could be the first step toward taking a closer look into the hood and making the kind of real trade-offs that we might need to support a better budget for the middle class.
And I think that's where the Biden administration needs to go, both in terms of helping create a political narrative around what does that foreign policy for the middle class look like, but also help politicians feel as though they're working towards something that they can talk about and measure. And we're not quite there yet. I think we can get there, but we're not there yet.
At the moment, though, our country doesn't exactly seem to be moving away from politicization of the military.
And so today, I'm honored to nominate former General Lloyd Austin as the 28th Secretary of Defense.
If confirmed, he would be the first African-American to head the Pentagon, but confirmation could be tricky.
He's loved by the men and women of the armed forces.
By law, defense secretaries have to be retired from active duty for at least 7 years.
Does it matter if a general is running the Pentagon?
Oh, man. I have gone through the 7 stages of grief on this 7 times.
Generals aren't actually supposed to run the Pentagon. Civilian control of the military and the idea that the military shouldn't be politicized is baked pretty deeply into the assumptions of our democracy. It's one of those things that, prevents things like military coups. So in order for a recently retired general to serve in this way, that general needs a waiver. Our current defense secretary, Lloyd Austin, is only the 3rd general ever to receive that kind of waiver. The first was George Marshall in 1950 under President Truman. And the second was James Mattis under President Trump.
We cannot step away or look away from the fact that having Secretary Mattis in the Pentagon, having General Flynn as National Security Advisor, having General Kelly as Chief of Staff, and having a substantially larger number of former general officers play a strong role in our politics has had an impact on how Americans view the military, on the politicization of the military, and the way the military sees themselves. I don't think Secretary Austin has shied away from that, but I also don't think it's something that you fix overnight.
She says that she's convinced that Secretary Austin was the right choice, in large part because of his good working relationship with Biden. But it's been a tough few years for politicization of the military.
If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
Let's see how these anarchists respond when the 101st Airborne is on the other side of the street.
And I've seen this tendency like, all right, guys, let's move on. Like, no, norms don't just fix because you have a new guy who promises not to break them. Norms are something that take a long time to heal.
But Loren says there are also some good things to come out of the last couple of years. Trends that might make it easier for Biden to sell the public on shifting our national security policies in a way that gives a leg up to the middle class. And part of that has to do with the pandemic.
Before, the submerged state was something that was eminently possible to ignore. You didn't have to see government anywhere. You went to the post office and you paid your taxes, but it would be very possible to pretend as though the federal government was not part of your day-to-day life. But in COVID, the CDC was a daily talking point. People know who Tony Fauci is, whether they like him or not. They know what NIH is. The IRS played a huge, unexpected role in providing immense relief to the American people over the last year.
In other words, we're more aware of what the government is doing on our behalf.
And on top of that, there was a poll that asked for many years in a row, do you want government to basically leave you alone or lend a helping hand? And the change in that from 2019 to 2020 was over 20 points. We want government to lend a helping hand. That's a big jump. So I see it as a dynamic moment for people to rethink what their relationship with government is. And I really hope government is taking that moment as well and rethinking how can we have a stronger and more productive and sustainable relationship with the American people.
If there was ever a time to begin to bridge the civil-military divide and have a real conversation with Americans about the future, it's now. Things That Go Boom is produced by Inkstick Media and distributed by PRX. This episode was produced by Ruth Morris and me, and edited by Katie Toth, Laylee Jaley, and Emily Vaughn. Darian Schulman writes the music for our show, and Robin Wise takes us all across the finish line. Thank you, as always, to the foundations that make our work possible, the Carnegie Corporation of New York and Plowshares Fund, as well as Inkstick supporters, including the Cologne Foundation, Craig Newmark Foundation, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. And thank you to all of you for supporting our show. If you'd like to do even more to support us, go on over and leave us a nice review. We love to hear from you anyway, so that's the best way to get in touch. And if you'd like to see more, come visit us on social at Inkstick Media. And as we approach the 20th anniversary of 9/11, spare a thought for Lacey as she competes in a rucking event. We'll see you right back here in 2 weeks.
Mostly it's bacon. And then I'll do the maple kind because when the sun comes up, there's just this great breakfasty feeling about it, I guess. And then do it with a shot of Fireball or whiskey. And it's so amazing. It just...
Okay, you had me until the Fireball. I'm well, just the idea of I'm very pregnant, right?
From PRX.